This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one decision or one country or one leader. This is about something quieter and far more dangerous. What happens when the system you are told is stable stops protecting you? Not all at once, but gradually, methodically, without ever announcing that it has changed. Because the most destabilizing shifts don't arrive with alarms. They arrive disguised as routine, as cooperation, as normal. You are told this is about safety, about balance, about neutrality. But what's actually happening is that the space to remain neutral is shrinking, and the cost of pretending otherwise is being transferred silently onto economies, onto institutions, onto ordinary people who never voted on any of this. If you're watching closely, you can already see the pressure lines forming. They don't look dramatic yet. That's the point. Stay with me. Because once these systems begin to move, they do not stop at borders. And they do not ask for consent. What actually controls this system now is not ideology, not alliances, not even governments. It's leverage, economic leverage, security leverage, narrative leverage. Power no longer operates by persuasion. It operates by exposure. Who depends on whose markets, whose jobs sit inside whose supply chains, whose currency absorbs the shock when pressure is applied. And once leverage replaces consensus, neutrality stops being a position. It becomes a vulnerability because the system no longer asks what you believe. It asks what you can afford to lose. Access, investment, employment, stability. This is why the old language fails here. Non-alignment, balance, strategic autonomy. Those words assume a system that still tolerates distance, but distance is now interpreted as resistance, and resistance triggers response. Not immediately, not visibly, but predictably, the mechanism is subtle. Pressure applied somewhere else, consequences felt locally, and once that cycle begins, the system doesn't need to announce intent. It only needs to keep tightening, which raises a dangerous question. If neutrality is no longer permitted, what replaces it? Hold that thought, because the answer didn't arrive suddenly. It arrived slowly, and most people missed it. There was a time when distance mattered before alignment was explicit. You signed it, you announced it, you defended it. Now alignment happens without being declared before economic cooperation stayed economic. Security stayed security. Narratives stayed rhetorical. That separation is gone. What changed was not a single event. It was normalization, military presence framed as routine cooperation, economic pressure framed as market behavior, information pressure framed as concern. Slow changes are the most dangerous ones because they feel voluntary while they are happening and irreversible once they are complete. What used to be exceptional is now procedural. What used to require justification now requires paperwork. What used to trigger debate now triggers silence. And the system adapts around you while you're still using the old map. You can see it in how pressure is applied, not to decision makers first, but to the environment around them. Jobs become conditional, access becomes temporary, stability becomes negotiable. Nothing breaks outright. It just becomes fragile. And fragility is not neutral. It favors whoever applies pressure last. This is where the danger hides. Not in the shift itself, but in how normal it now feels. Because once normalization sets in, the first visible shock doesn't look like a warning. It looks like an exception. And that's when systems fail quietly, right before they fail publicly. The first shock doesn't announce itself as a crisis. It arrives as a decision elsewhere, a change in terms, a recalibration. On paper, it looks technical, a tariff adjustment, a funding pause, a trade review, but downstream, the impact is immediate. Factories slow, export orders thin, agricultural shipments hesitate, And suddenly, numbers that used to sit in reports move into lives. Tens of thousands of jobs placed at risk. Not because of productivity, not because of demand, but because alignment has become a condition of access. This is how pressure works now, not as punishment, as exposure. Entire sectors become signaling tools. Automotive, agriculture, industries chosen not for symbolism, but for sensitivity. The message doesn't need to be explicit. It doesn't need to be repeated. The system learns quickly. What's dangerous here is not the scale of the shock. It's its precision. Because once economic pressure is calibrated this way, it doesn't stay external. It moves inward, into budgets, into coalitions, into social stability. And that raises the question no one wants to answer yet. If economic survival is now contingent, who decides the terms? Here's the part the system never explains out loud. Pressure is no longer applied to states. It's applied to dependencies. Who sells into which market? Who employs whom? Who absorbs the first loss when access narrows? That's the mechanism. When leverage is economic, the damage is asymmetric by design. The actor applying pressure feels delay. The actor receiving it feels shock. And the shock is not distributed evenly. Investors adjust, capital reroutes, institutions issue warnings, but workers don't reroute. Communities don't hedge, coalitions don't rebalance fast enough. So the cost concentrates downward. This is why the system doesn't need confrontation. It needs predictability. Once markets understand that alignment influences access, behavior changes without instruction, decisions get pre-filtered, risks get internalized, silence becomes compliance. And the beneficiaries are obvious. Those who control access points, those who set the terms, those who can apply pressure without appearing responsible for the outcome. Everyone else absorbs the adjustment. This is how power hides inside process. And why responsibility becomes impossible to trace. Because by the time the damage is visible, no single decision can be blamed. Only a system doing exactly what it was redesigned to do. And that system is about to be tested again, faster this time. Then the pressure accelerates. Not gradually, sequentially. Signals overlap. Warnings stack. Timelines compress. A military exercise becomes a headline. A headline becomes a statement. A statement becomes a response. Economic levers move faster than diplomacy. Markets react before ministers speak. Institutions scramble to quantify damage already underway. Nothing is officially declared. That's what makes it unstable. One decision triggers 3 interpretations. Each interpretation triggers a different response. None of them coordinated, coalition strain. Partners disagree. Messaging fractures. And the system stops behaving like a system because leverage doesn't tolerate ambiguity for long. It demands alignment or consequences. So the space between action and reaction disappears. What used to take months now takes days. What used to be negotiated is now assumed. And inside that acceleration, something critical happens. The pressure is no longer external. It's internal. Applied through budgets, through employment, through social cohesion, that's when escalation becomes irreversible. Not because of intent, but because momentum replaces choice. And once momentum takes over, even restraint becomes a liability. Which brings this directly to you. This is where it stops being abstract, because you don't experience leverage as a concept. You experience it as instability, as prices that won't hold, as contracts that don't renew, as jobs that suddenly feel provisional. You are told this is global, strategic, unavoidable. But what reaches you is simpler. Uncertainty, the sense that decisions made far away have begun to reorganize your life without explanation. That alignment debates you were never invited into are now shaping what you can afford, what you can plan, what you can risk. And the most destabilizing part is not the loss itself, it's the timing. Nothing collapses all at once. It just stops being reliable. Institutions warn. Officials reassure, but neither can reverse momentum once it's underway. So the burden shifts quietly onto households, onto workers, onto people expected to absorb shocks in the name of stability. If this feels distant, it won't stay that way. Because once economic pressure becomes a policy tool, everyone inside the system becomes part of the mechanism. Stay with me. Because what's happening here is no longer contained. What began as a local recalibration doesn't stay local because leverage travels. Supply chains don't recognize borders. Financial confidence doesn't stop at customs. Political signaling echoes far beyond its point of origin. Other states watch closely, not for statements, but for consequences. They measure how pressure is applied, how quickly it works, how much resistance costs, and they adjust. Some move closer to power for protection. Some hedge harder. Some accelerate militarization quietly, preemptively. What disappears is the middle ground. Neutrality becomes suspicious. Delay becomes defiance. Silence becomes a signal. This is how regional tension becomes systemic risk. Not through invasion, through imitation. Once one state absorbs pressure, others prepare for the same treatment. They restructure trade. They harden alliances. They shorten timelines. And the system tightens globally. What's unfolding is not fragmentation, it's synchronization around fear. Because when pressure works once, it becomes policy everywhere. And that leaves the world with fewer buffers, fewer off-ramps, fewer places where shock can dissipate, which forces a question that can no longer be avoided. If this trajectory continues, what comes next? From here, the system doesn't settle. It accelerates, and there are only three directions it can go. The first is adjustment. Governments quietly recalibrate. Language softens. Exercises become symbolic. Economic exposure is managed just enough to slow the bleed. Nothing is resolved, but nothing snaps. The system survives by narrowing choices and calling it stability. The second path is erosion. Pressure continues unevenly. Jobs leak away. Coalitions weaken. Institutions issue warnings that arrive too late to change outcomes. Trust thins. Public consent phrase. Foreign policy becomes something endured, not debated. The state still functions, but legitimacy becomes conditional. The third path is rupture, a misread signal, an overcorrection, a domestic shock that forces a visible choice. Alignment hardens, retaliation follows. Economic pressure turns explicit, and what was once framed as neutrality collapses into confrontation. None of these paths announce themselves in advance. They overlap. They blur. Adjustment can slide into erosion. Erosion can snap into rupture. And the system doesn't choose among them. It drifts until an external shock decides for it, which is why the most dangerous moment is not ahead. It's now, because the direction isn't locked in yet. But the speed is, there is a temptation at this point to look for balance, for reassurance, for a rule that says systems correct themselves before they break. But this system doesn't correct. It selects who absorbs pressure first, who gets time, who runs out of it. What's disappearing here is not sovereignty in theory, it's room to maneuver in practice. The ability to delay, to hedge, to stay ambiguous long enough for pressure to dissipate. That space is closing. And once it's gone, every decision becomes a signal, even inaction, even restraint. You are not watching a crisis unfold. You are watching the conditions that make future crises unavoidable. The danger is not that someone will choose wrong. It's that soon there may be no choice that doesn't carry consequences. So the question isn't who's right or who's to blame. The question is whether a system built on leverage can coexist with societies built on consent. Because once pressure replaces permission, the next shock won't need an explanation. If you want to understand what happens next, not just here, but everywhere this model spreads, you need to keep watching, because the most important shifts are still happening quietly.